Welcome, everyone. Today's session is a learning session as opposed to an office hours session. So during a learning session, we will hear from some subject matter experts on a particular topic. So today I'm really excited to introduce Genevieve and Daniela, who will be leading us through today's session. They'll be giving a short presentation, and then they've prepared some prompts for reflection and discussion and peer learning, and we'll break out into breakout groups. So I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to pass it off to my colleagues. So take it away. I think I'll pass to Genevieve first, and then Genevieve can navigate the rest. So take it away, Genevieve.
Thank you. Hey, everybody. I'm Genevieve Godet. I'm a director of design here at NAVA. My pronouns are she, her. I'm coming to you from very sunny Los Angeles. I'm happy to be here today to talk about user research. So today we are really going to dive into what is user research. You know, when we talk about it, like what are we fundamentally talking about? And there are a few different methods that we're going to tell you about from some of the projects that we've worked on here at NAVA. And we're really going to map them to the product lifecycle that LP was telling you about in our last session. So you'll see some of those themes start to come back up if you've been following along with the show this whole time. And the goal is really to start to get a shared understanding of what some of these methods are, get you familiar with them, and also start thinking about in your organizations, you know, where might you find yourself in this sort of program or product lifecycle. And so what methods might be appropriate for you to use on some of the challenges that you're facing or some of the problems you're working on in your day-to-day. And we'll talk about that in breakouts together, and then we'll come back together and share some of those reflections. But before we do that, I want to take us to that product lifecycle. So if we go to the next slide, Daniela and I have kind of taken a simplified version of that product development lifecycle that we usually go through on agile projects. We're building a piece of software. Right, and we split them into 3 phases. You can think about them as in the first phase, we're really understanding what to build. So this might be a phase where you know you have a problem facing your program or facing your clients or even your staff, but you're not quite sure how to solve it yet, not sure what we're going to build. In phase 2, there are some methods we'll talk about for making sure that we are building the thing correctly. And then in phase 3, this is where we have a program or a piece of software live out in the world. And we are finding ways to improve that experience for something that already exists. So we'll really be talking in terms of these 3 phases, kind of through the stories that we're going to share. So if we take a closer look at that first phase on the next slide, I would love to share a story with you that kind of highlights how we like to approach this when we're in that really early phase of a project. And the background here is that NAVA worked with the Commonwealth of Massachusetts on a program to design and build an entirely new service. And in this case, the service was a paid family medical leave program. So qualified workers could apply for paid leave if they had, if they needed medical leave, or if they were going to take like a family leave to take care of a loved one or to take care of a new baby or an adopted child. And this is a really big deal because there was no infrastructure yet, right? There was no department that existed. The service didn't exist. There was no like legacy system we were working with. And our partners in Massachusetts had a really good idea of who was going to be involved. So there are workers, of course, there are the employers they're taking leave from. There are insurance companies who provide, you know, plans that employers can be on that might be alternatives to the state plan. There are the medical providers who, can kind of attest to the condition a worker might have or their need for leave. There are just lots of people who kind of weigh in on the system. And the state, kind of had this idea that in addition to providing a way for workers to apply and employers to, be involved in that process, they were kind of sure that doctors, like healthcare providers, also needed a website to log into so that they could like upload forms and things like that. And that's really the problem we're going to narrow in on for the story. So as part of that, like understanding what we should build, because it's a lot, right? Like a website for workers, a website for employers, a website for doctors, a website for insurance companies. We did a few different things. We created a service map with the Commonwealth to understand just all kind of the steps that needed to happen to provide someone with their paid leave benefit. And we did journey mapping to understand what people needed to do. And if you look on the right side of the slide, you see an example of the journey a healthcare provider would go through. Sorry, and you see there's like kind of big stages, there's steps. We have a little like wave graphic in there to show like when something's easy versus when the provider might be burdened. And we gave the state some more context about those things. And we were developing these all from interviews we were doing with healthcare providers and their staff to give context to those situations. And what we found that helped us understand what to build in this case was that healthcare providers were pretty overburdened in this process. They are like, obviously they're seeing patients and they're helping people with their medical issues. They were really unwilling to log into another website to upload these forms, and asking them to do that could actually delay the process of getting people their leave. And so instead, we made a decision that we would focus on making it easy for claimants to submit their own medical forms, and we're able to decide to pivot away from building a website directly for healthcare providers, and instead focus our designing and our building efforts on the claimant and employer experiences. And so that's that first phase, right? Like, how are we going to narrow down what to build? How are we going to sort through sort of what everyone needs to be up to and make some decisions about how to target our resources and where to intervene through the software we're building or the service what we're providing. So that's phase one. That's like getting to a good understanding of what we will actually build. And I'm going to hand it to Daniela to talk about how we think about user research in phase two, when we already know what we're going to build.
Yeah, thanks, Genevieve. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, cool, thanks. So let's talk about that next phase, phase two. So again, this is around validating we're building it right. So we've already kind of defined those key learnings. We've kind of scoped in on like what it is that would be most valuable for us to be spending our time and our effort on. And so we have some definition around who our users are and what their needs are and like what those key journeys are. So now we're focusing on making sure that what we're proposing to build is going to meet users where they are. So in this story, I'm actually going to talk us through an example from a project we did with the US Department of Veterans Affairs on a product called Caseflow. And this is where VA staff and attorneys and judges process and rule on appeals that veterans make on their VA benefits. So this is kind of an internal tool for folks who are helping veterans go through that process. And so one of the stakeholder group's priorities, and they're called the board, and it's made up of a bunch of important people at the VA, including a lot of legal experts. One of their priorities was really around converting manual processes that attorneys and different caseworkers were going through, turning those manual processes into digital ones in order to increase the overall efficiency within the appeals process. The manual processes that the staff had to perform outside of this main piece of software that we were working on and that they use meant that like things were getting missed, context wasn't making it into case notes that were shifting between different folks who were responsible at different parts of the process for that case. And just overall, those types of manual processes that happen outside of the product, as I'm sure many of you are aware of, increases the burden on staff to just get everything that they need to get done. And all in all, those types of burdens on staff resulted in impacts to the timeliness of the appeals process for veterans, for those end users, which was not what we wanted to see. So what we're looking at here on the right is an example of starting to move that manual process into that digital process. And where we started was with like a task or a user flow. So this kind of builds off of the map that Genevieve was just showing on the previous slide. But instead of looking at it at a high level and looking at the entire journey, we're really focusing in on what is like that one thing, that one task that somebody needs to complete at a certain point in time. And so this method can take a lot of work because what you're essentially doing is mapping out all of the intricacies of that process, all the inputs and all of the outcomes, all the decision points before we can start to translate that into an online experience. So here, each step is really becoming its own discrete box representing a singular action or a decision. And while this can seem tedious, it's super important. Piecing apart a process like this helped us as designers better understand what's essential to include to ensure that whatever we build produces the same outcome for staff, and then also ultimately the end users, the veterans. It also helped us like align with our stakeholders to make sure that we weren't missing anything. So this helps us inform the design of the product, especially in a product like Caseflow, which is very text heavy. It's a lot of forms. It's a lot of, different inputs that somebody needs to read through. This helped us start to think about, okay, like what would this translate to in the design as well? So like this might become a modal, or this might become an alert, or maybe this is a form field, a drop down, whatever. So breaking up the overall process into these discrete tasks helped us understand where we might be also collecting duplicate information because we were moving something that was like like people were doing manually outside the product. Maybe they were doing something twice and they didn't necessarily realize it, or mapping it out, we can start to realize it and make sure that like we're not asking somebody to do the same thing twice. We can really just distill this interaction down to what it is that we need to do to achieve the key goal that this task is trying to do. So this flow, this part of the product is something that, again, the caseworkers are processing, and a lot of the time that's like staff or attorneys. So it was very important that we validated this with our stakeholders to make sure that everything was translated correctly. How we did that was we facilitated concept testing to do that validation. So during a number of testing sessions, we shared this visual of the flow, our concept, got a couple of prepared questions and asked those attorneys to like walk through this. If you were doing this, are we missing anything? Does this make sense? And in this activity, we were able to ensure that it did replicate that manual experience step by step, and it produced the same legal outcomes. So that was the key thing that we were looking for. And this was also a fairly quick way to ensure that the key user group of the attorneys, their feedback was incorporated into this process before we built anything out. So essentially going through this de-risked any designs that we ended up producing from this flow. So from this overall feedback, we were able to validate what we had mapped out for the flow, what we were planning on building, making sure that it produced the same outcomes as the manual process, and make sure that the attorneys were satisfied that it met the legal requirements. And so from there, we did design wireframes of the needed interactions for users to complete the task in the product. We were confident that this new feature in the product would help reduce some of the manual burden that the attorneys were facing in processing those appeals. So you can see this flow turned into this screen underneath. It feels like a very small thing, but it was very important and did reduce in decreased time for this part of the process. So now I'm going to move us into the next phase. We've validated that we're building it right. And phase 3 is about improving the experience. So this is that last phase in the product development cycle that we were talking about. At this point, you typically have something live or in production that you're looking to iterate on in order to improve that overall experience for your users. So this next project came about in the spring of 2020. And I'm sure you're all familiar, some stuff was going on and states were dealing with unprecedented numbers of people applying for unemployment and other benefits. And so states were working on one hand to incorporate new rules and benefits expansions into their systems on their sides. And then on the other side, what they were feeling was massive increases in page traffic and folks reaching out asking how they could get help. So in the absence of updated guidance on those application procedures for new pandemic-related programs, unemployed Californians struggled to find clear information on whether to and how to apply for unemployment benefits. And the result for residents was a lot of frustration and anxiety for already stressed out individuals. And then on the inside, government staff was also facing like crazy workloads that they'd not seen before, super high call center traffic, just to try and provide that customer support. And additionally, because of the lack of clear information, it was adding to their workloads in that they were having to manually process incorrectly filed applications. So as a result, the NAVA team was asked to help the state of California work on something to better inform residents on how to apply for and receive unemployment benefits so that they could get through the process easily and quickly. So this is an example of where we had something, but we were just adding in a little bit of new content, and that amount of content made us think about how might we shift the design in order to better display that content. We did need to add in that new guidance, but we also had to make sure it was like readable and understandable in plain language. And we also had to design that all in a way that ensured that someone could visually parse it and approach it without adding to that overwhelm that folks had already stated that they were facing. So the process here was we moved all of the content, the new guidance and the old guidance from the previous version of this page into a Google Doc. And from there, we were able to quickly start to make changes to that original content based on basic plain language principles and the new guidance, and consult with our stakeholders on the California team to make sure that the language remained legal and accurate. And we treated this Google Doc as the source of truth for content, and we maintained a decision log at the top that allowed us to keep track of major changes and reviews. The previous experience for this page was just a static page. It was really long and text heavy. It was basically just like a long list. And our early testing of that page proved that it was like really difficult for users to parse and understand understand where they should focus their attention on that page. So we were, on the one hand, going through and drafting updated content. And in doing so, we were able to inform an early prototype of how we might reimagine the unemployment guide as opposed to just a page. And we used this prototype to conduct some usability testing through interviews, and to also use it as a communication tool through the building process to make sure everyone was aligned internally about the shape of the guide, the flow through it, the visual structure, and most importantly, that new content. So in usability testing, we were able to test the content as well as the experience. So we asked participants to focus on completing a task around understanding how to apply for benefits within that prototype. And in the testing, we learned that the new design, the steps in this guide format really resonated with users, but they were still experiencing some alienation around unclear language, especially around like freelancers and self-employed individuals, like what they were eligible for and if or how they would apply. So this gave us kind of two paths forward. So first, we validated that design so engineering could start working on that. So they started working on that. It was validated. They're good to go with starting with some of those tweaks. And then from the testing, we were able to use those learnings to make recommendations for improved content. We reviewed that with our stakeholders, and we wove some of those recommendations into that working draft that everyone was working from. And then when we had a final say and final approval there, we were able to make sure that engineering saw that, and they were able to work from that document to implement the content for the new guide online. So usability testing, content testing kind of went hand in hand in this case, kind of were pushing on each other in this case. But all of that work helped us quickly iterate the design and content for the guide, launching a human-centered, more plain language experience that demonstrated how users could better understand the differences between the different programs and how to apply for each of them. And as a result, we were able to get this online, get it live, and then the following ways in which we could ensure that this was meeting users' needs was actually through tracking Google Analytics and page views, and then also maintaining that call center, not maintaining, sorry, also making sure that we were tapped into what folks were hearing in the call center and the questions they were receiving. So that's that phase 3, improving the experience. I'm going to move us back to the, what was the slide? Move us back to the product development cycle to just kind of summarize everything that we talked about today. This is not comprehensive. There's a ton of user research methods that Genevieve and I didn't get to today. But this is the summary of what we showed. So how interviews and mapping can help you in that first phase. Concept testing, user flows, mapping out task flows can help you in that second phase. And then focusing in on kind of like discrete usability testing and content testing can help you in this third phase, improving the experience. All right, I need to take a breath. I think that Martel is going to move us into breakout rooms now.
Yeah, I think before we do that, thank you so much, Daniela and Genevieve. We can open it up for questions. And actually, I have a question. There's a couple of different testing terms on here. And when you explained each one individually, they made sense. But I'm curious, like, what is the difference between concept testing, usability testing, content testing?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think I will answer your question, but I also want to preface it with like, it's cool to know the difference, but it kind of doesn't matter. Like the big idea is like putting things in front of people and getting their feedback. And those show up in phase 2 and phase 3 because it's when we do have something, right? We've sort of moved into a phase where there is something to show or there's something to respond to that like you can either show to staff or to clients or beneficiaries. But in general, concept testing is when you're really looking at early designs. And so this can be a prototype, but sometimes we're doing content testing on like a single page, or even a really low fidelity of what one single page might look like. And sometimes we call that like a wireframe. This could be even just like in the early days of Massachusetts, the paid leave program, we did concept testing on like a paragraph of text that just explained what the program did. And we used that to really get a good idea of what was confusing about this program conceptually for people. So what were we going to need to focus on when we made more content and more kind of different features and flows. But you can also do it for, the layout of a page, maybe a form that you're working on. And then as we move later to that usability testing and content testing, it's becoming more detailed, right? And especially for something like usability testing, where we have an interaction, we want to test out, like, can someone upload this form, or can someone give us this information, or can they create an account? We actually want to see them do that, right? That's the test. Like, can you complete a task here, rather than like, does this generally make sense to you? In content testing, can kind of fall along that spectrum, but in this case, we're talking about like, in the context of this page, does all the content on this page make sense? Can you follow these directions? Are they clear? And so it's sort of different levels of detail that we're looking at testing, and different points that we're testing at. But the general idea is, as soon as we've got something, we want to put it in front of people, because that's going to help us move to the next phase. Daniela, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that was good. I think I would just say that like a concept can be anything. It really refers to the fidelity of what you are testing. Like, it just refers to that something is earlier on in its development. And then like as we like refine what we're thinking about more, or like refine the design or get more requirements, or like we're pushing it further along the process. And then it's like, okay, specifically, what is it that we want to test? Like, what is it that we are trying to validate, or what is it that we're trying to make sure we got right specifically? So it just depends on the phase. But truly anything can be a concept. It's just how early on are you looking at it?
Thank you. Thank you both. And we actually have a set of questions from one of our participants. Could you highlight if and which so, or if so, which, I'm sorry, could you highlight if and if so, which phases or steps along this timeline are iterative, and which tend to be the most time intensive? So which ones are iterative and which ones are time intensive?
So great question. I'm going to answer the time intensive one first and just say it depends, which is the worst answer to hear sometimes, but I think it just always depends. Typically, you'll probably spending more time in kind of this like phase 2 bucket. But if you, for example, do depend to plan, sorry, getting my words mixed up. If you do plan to spend more time in phase 1, maybe it is because of where you are in the overall like process of your project. This is kind of a comprehensive cycle that we're looking at, but oftentimes if you're looking at a project that is fairly long and you just want to add a feature, you may not go through this entire cycle for a specific feature. So there's like some depends there, but generally I would say phase 2. I think that some of the stuff that we talked today showed how iteration could be, you can kind of like use iteration for at any of these phases, and some of the artifacts that we showed are the result of iteration. Like we made something, we showed it to folks, we learned a little bit more, and we changed it as a result. So this first method here, interviews, like that probably gives you a ton of information. You don't necessarily have a bunch of stuff that you've done before you do these kind of like discovery interviews. But then like as you start to make things, you'll iterate those based on your learnings as you continue to go on through the process. Genevieve, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I think I would just add that they, sort of how you were talking about when you first start interviews, you haven't made anything yet, but after you talk to a few people, you're probably going to start asking different questions, right? And so there's a little bit of iteration there in terms of like maybe what your vision for this is, or the process that's becoming, a little more clear that you need to follow. And then, if we think about it in sort of the terms of the agile process, there are little loops like this sort of throughout, especially once we move really broadly into like actually building something, actually prototyping. So I think the goal is to really set yourself up to have a loop of getting feedback from folks, whether that is on early concepts, on sort of in progress work, or on things that are existing. So ideally, you're sort of setting up a little engine that kind of kicks you off once you understand what to build, and just loops you through kind of continuously throughout that process. So the goal is really like, kind of ongoing iteration.
Thank you. Yeah, so all phases, all steps can be iterative. And I like particularly the point that you brought up, Genevieve, like even the questions that you're asking during the different types of testing or interviews that you're doing, that can be iterative too. And I know that is a big paradigm shift from like traditional research. So user research versus traditional research, everything is very standardized, and you're like getting themes and drawing conclusions. With this type of user research, the goal is to learn so you can make things better, right? And so it's okay to iterate those questions and how you're approaching the testing too. And I know in my experience, that was like a very big aha moment. So just wanted to double emphasize what Genevieve highlighted about that. So thank you. Great. So I think now we'll spend some time in some breakout groups to talk about applications of user research to your own projects that you're working on, some reflecting on what design and development projects you have going on right now. What activities have you currently done to engage users that you want to share with the group? So maybe there are other activities that you've done that we haven't talked about today that would be useful to share within your group. Or maybe you've done some of the ones we've talked about today. And then finally, is there anything that you're interested in trying to implement after hearing some of today's stories, or any other questions in general related to getting started or implementing some of these methods within the context of your project? So I'm going to go ahead and open up all of the rooms. I've created 4 rooms, and folks can actually, it looks like I may need to.
And actually, Martell, while you're doing that, I was just going to also just say, you know, for folks, I know a lot of folks on this call are from agencies that are National WIC Association members. And if you as you move forward from this, please do feel free to connect with me. I am here to support you all, even if you're not from a member agency, and you're just interested in bouncing some ideas off. I'll put my contact information in the chat, but want to be a resource as you think through these and come out of these sessions with these great ideas of what you're going to do. We're here to help. So
yeah. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and bring us to breakout rooms, and we can hopefully have some exciting conversation.